this Christian university who also has an interest in this thing we call science, social science, public health, and so on. He's going to talk to us today about schools of thought.
I may need, see how well I can project my sickly voice, but if there's any trouble hearing me, I could use the mic. Let me just explain where this paper began and what I'm trying to get at. This grew out of a conversation I started with Peter Betke about 4 years ago about pluralism and what pluralism means and why it might be important in economic scholarship. And Pete, in 2007, wrote a blog post in which he made the bold argument that scholarly pluralism was something we should value at the level of the discipline of economics as a whole, and we should celebrate the fact that there are different perspectives out there. But it would be inappropriate to expect or demand that at the level of the individual scholar. Because the invisible hand will do all that we need to generate pluralism, and really the ethics and motivations of the individual scholar are irrelevant because the process of competition in the marketplace of ideas will sort out the relative value of ideas, and it just doesn't matter. And I took issue with this for a number of reasons, but mostly because it disagreed with a lot of things that Peter himself had written in previous work. And I accused him of being Mandevillean rather than Smithian in his understanding of how private vices lead to public virtues. And so began this conversation. I ended up writing a paper which has just been published in the Review of Austrian Economics called Why Should Austrian Economists Be Pluralist? And Pete's written a response, and it's a nice little symposium that's just been published there. This paper has a different emphasis, but it's cut from the same cloth. And what I'm trying to essentially argue is that as members of academic or scientific communities, we are never just specialists. We are also citizens. And as citizens, we have certain ethical duties to our fellow scholars in how we conduct ourselves in the marketplace of ideas. Arguing this with Deirdre in the room means I have to just acknowledge that much of this is sort of old McCloskey wine and slightly new bottles. Although part of what's new about this for me is linking what I learned from Deirdre years ago about rhetoric to parts of James Buchanan's constitutional political economy, as well as to notions that were important to Don Lavoie about continual learning from one's intellectual opponents. As you probably realize, because it's been said for a long time, but it's also been in the news of late, social science schools have a bad reputation with regard to the marketplace of ideas. They're seen as rent-seeking cabals, tribes, clans, sects, factions, folks who are more interested in securing their own protected turf rather than intellectual free trade. And we've heard this for many years in economics, directly and indirectly. Frank Hahn in 1984 wrote that the existence of multiple schools of thought in economics is, quote, a sure sign of our ignorance, since each school's passionately held beliefs and strident commitments of faith create barriers to intellectual trade while adding little to scientific understanding.
And Frank's work is an excellent case of this. Good point. Sorry.
I take that as a friendly amendment.
Well, but Frank Hahn would say something is just shocking.
Yeah. Well, unless you know him. In a not quite in the same light, but I think with a similar premise, Milton Friedman at the 1976 South Royalton Conference, where the modern school of Austrian economics claims its birth, made the remark that there is no Austrian economics, just good economics and bad economics. I think the larger gist of that, and this is something that Deirdre, Tim, and Sandra, and David, and others in this room have written about in great detail, is the idea of science as a unified and unifying enterprise, so that we should expect and want one church, one nation, one republic of science, not different tribes or versions thereof. My view is that schools of thought in the social sciences are in need of two things. Number one, a reasoned defense, and number two, a renewed commitment to the scholarly virtues of liberal learning. I think the critics who see schools as impediments to intellectual progress have a point, but I don't think they see the whole picture. I think they don't see the ways in which schools enhance intellectual and academic freedom and learning in economics and across the social sciences. At the same time, these factional tendencies of schools are undeniable and problematic. So what I want to put on the table is the idea that the chances for sustained learning in the social sciences would be improved substantially if more scholars were willing and able to practice the liberal art of honoring their own traditions and commitments on the one hand, while engaging in mutually informative dialogue with others as well. Having grown up on the left-wing side of the tracks in graduate school, we thought and argued a lot about labor and unions and other things. And there is an analogy that strikes me here between schools of thought and trade unions, in that if we think about what's happened to the moral authority of trade unions in the 20th century, a big part of the problem is that unions today are almost exclusively identified with their factional interests, and they're seen, therefore, as economic and political rent seekers. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm saying that that's how they are perceived, and that's how a lot of their authority has eroded. Union advocates and critics alike seem to have lost sight of the broader civic purposes that once characterized the trade union movement. I think academic schools of thought could learn something from this, and to make sure that it's clear that their mission is not just to promote their own commodity, but to contribute to the larger conversations of which they are a part. Now, one thing that I'm not going to talk about today that's very important to this topic is the educational prerequisites that would be implied by the scholarly virtues that I'm going to talk about. You know, what sorts of undergraduate and graduate curricula would support the enactment of these kind of scholarly duties by the everyday economist or whatever other scholar we're speaking of. David Colander has written a lot about this. I myself have ventured into this a little bit, and it's an important thing we could discuss in the questions, but I won't speak to it in my presentation. Since I first wrote these ideas, I've had the chance to read some of David and Sandra's work on the problem of faction in classical liberalism, and I've learned from it, and I'm now even more comfortable situating my approach to these questions as part of the classical liberal tradition of Smith, James Madison, and John Stuart Mill, recognizing the problem of faction, but addressing it not by trying to eliminate factions, but by trying instead to limit their deleterious effects and harness their potential to serve the greater good. Two other sources that really directly inform this paper are the works of Michael Polanyi, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and a couple of essays by Stephen Balch that you probably are not familiar with, and I'll come to those in a moment. Michael Polanyi, as you probably know, is a chemist and best known as a philosopher of science who wrote an essay published in 1969 that many in economics especially love because it's I can remember the title, The Republic of Science, Its Economic and Political Theory, I believe is the title. But the case is made that science is usually understood as a self-organizing system, very much along the lines of how economists have understood market systems. Interestingly, the political part, which is announced in the title, and which is also suggested by the term republic, isn't developed in nearly as great a detail. And this is something that I see my work is trying to add to. I've also, though not systematically, but have sampled other parts of Polanyi's work in personal knowledge, the logic of liberty, and the tacit dimension. And I found it to be very rich in sort of painting a hermeneutical conception of the individual scientist, emphasizing the creative freedom as well as the epistemic responsibility of the scientist as a specialist, okay? But what's missing or not developed in Polanyi's account is the scientist's role as a citizen within this republic of science that he describes. Stephen Balch, I don't know if he still is, but he was for a long time the head of the National Association of Scholars, and he wrote an essay in 2004 at the height of the controversy over David Horowitz's Academic Bill of Rights. And there was a piece called An Antidote to Academic Orthodoxy. And it was a great piece because, unlike the other, many of the other comments on that issue were, just sort of predictable liberal or conservative viewpoints. He took a more Smithian or Madisonian approach and made the case that schools of thought in the humanities and social sciences are fraught with difficulty, but have been and should continue to be an integral, positive part of the knowledge-creating process in these disciplines. But he was very clear about the kinds of coordination failures, we economists would say, that these disciplines are prone to. In his words, they're unable to sustain a free and open marketplace of ideas, tending instead to become, quote, divided into enduring factions whose partisans frequently treat their opponents more as foes than colleagues. And in that kind of a situation, schools of thought do indeed become part of the problem. They become barriers rather than catalysts to competition. And Balch laments this as a substantial contraction of serious academic discourse about the human condition, etc. Now, he offers an interesting diagnosis, and I'll just briefly hit on the 3 points, the 3 causes of this problem that he points to. And he says that this is characteristic of the humanities and social science. Less so, he says, in the natural sciences, though I'm sure we could think of reason to disagree with this. But he characterizes the natural sciences as better able to sustain reasoned discourse because they're better able to appeal to logic and evidence in a manner that converges rather than diverges. In the social sciences and humanities, he says there is inherent complexity and ambiguity in the subject matter. The phenomena treated in these disciplines, involving as they do the tangled skein of human action, are much more ambiguous and complex. They're characterized by fuzzy concepts, contested analytic frameworks, a paucity of reliable data, and chronic difficulties in formulating decisive tests of rival hypotheses. What reigns instead is judgment, at best informed by good sense, relevant learning, and careful observation, but never entirely transcending the slippery realm of opinion. Such cloudiness gives even greater opportunities for the prejudicial treatment of dissent. Number 2, obviously directly related, scholarly partisanship. The fact that professors in humanities and social science disciplines characteristically bring to their analysis vastly stronger feelings about the answers than that they would prefer to find. Those recruited to the study of these disciplines usually arrive already equipped with strong dispositions toward one or another of the warring factions, giving rise in many cases to career-long partisanship. Number 3, and this is what he ultimately wants to focus on, he claims that academic governance structures, particularly within departments, tend to amplify rather than dissipate these factionalist disorders. Academic departments, he says, by virtue of their powers over curriculum, personnel, and graduate student funding, often become little republics, subject to all the dangers memorably delineated by Madison and Federalist 10. Being diminutive, Balch argues, departments easily fall under the sway of compact majorities that persistently monopolize positions of power and grind down opponents. And because the admission of new academic citizens is subject to the majority's control, as time passes, those majorities tend to expand, eventually generating their own factions, But in such a context, the subsequent splitting often leaves departments little more than nests of wrangling sectarians. So, bottom line, for all of these reasons, schools tend to become entrenched, inward-looking orthodoxies who are more interested in preserving comfortable environments for their orthodoxies rather than in maintaining free debate. And I think all of us can easily recognize that description of many departments and disciplines. Now, my focus is a little different from Balch's because I'm really trying to think about disciplines and the role of schools of thought within them, whereas his focus ultimately is more within universities and departments. He's also looking more at how we can creatively change the formal rules of the game. For instance, he proposes proportional voting on curriculum and hiring decisions to allow dissenters a fractional share of, a fractional voice. And he suggests allowing distinct schools of thought to sort of form their own semi-autonomous units with some, amount of budget and hiring authority. I don't want to take issue with that, but my focus is more on the informal rules side of things and how we might address the problems that he has identified from what Buchanan would call a constitutional political economy perspective. Trying to reframe the marketplace of ideas, or science if we want to call it that, as a space not just of intellectual liberty, where you're free to specialize and transact as you wish, but also a sphere of constitutional responsibility. And so I want to talk about the informal rules through which those liberties and duties are defined and enacted. In the paper and in some other work of mine, talk about academic pluralism as a name that we could give to this scholarly duty. And it's very similar to what Deirdre McCloskey has described as rhetoric. And there are other thinkers who have described similar things in their own terms. Let me just be clear, though, because the word pluralism often sounds like something that, for me, it is not. I do not mean it to refer to pluralism and economic explanation, that is, that every scholar should be required to, in their research, produce multiple explanations of things, nor to, I don't think each scholar should, be expected to have allegiance to multiple paradigms, although it's a possibility, but what I mean is just an ethic of responsible academic citizenship that urges us to conduct our business in a more cosmopolitan, less sectarian manner. So a professional commitment to intellectual tolerance, openness, and broad-mindedness. I call it academic pluralism because it very much lines up with the ethical and epistemological norms of what, at least in the US, and I would suppose in other countries, although I don't know this for a fact, is meant by academic freedom. Famously, academic freedom is the freedom to be left alone, to choose your own objects and methods of research. But if you read the AAUP documents from 1915 forward, where academic freedom is defined, it always also includes the academic duty to actively promote the conditions of free inquiry by engaging the ideas of fellow scholars in a spirit of epistemic humility, critical contestation, and mutual learning. I put the word pluralism next to academic because, to me, it signifies a Smithian awareness that no scholar is an island, that we are all specialized knowers, and so just like the members of Adam Smith's Commercial Society, we stand at all times in need of the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes. And so this, whatever we want to call the larger conversation, the Republic of Science, or whatever we want to call it, no individual or group within that conversation is epistemically self-sufficient. So the perspective being argued is pluralist because it recognizes that anything worthy of being called knowledge is the joint product of many minds. And this has consequences for how we think about our identities and our commitments as knowers, because we are never just part of a school of thought. we are never, for that matter, even just part of one discipline. Those local affiliations are always nested within larger conversations, which is what thinkers like James Bryant Conant referred to as the citadel of learning, to refer to the larger conversation. Oakeshott, of course, the conversation of humankind. Polanyi had the Society of Explorers. Alan Bloom speaks of the community of man, all referring to the same largeness of discourse that we are always part of and sort of nested within. Now, I have to acknowledge a couple of debts and specify some things regarding Deirdre's work and Buchanan's, which I referred to briefly before. And the two go together, and I increasingly, this is something I discovered in working out this paper, that for a long time, Deirdre, your rhetoric has struck me as, and I think you yourself referred to this at one point, that the rhetoric is sort of like academic free banking, that it allows the rules and the media of scholarly exchange to emerge from the marketplace of ideas itself. So our arguments and our perspectives may be, incommensurable ex ante, but they become intelligible and comparable to one another through our repeated interactions. And as we talk and argue with each other, the norms and procedures and media of exchange emerge. Now, this connects to Buchanan's work because what that really means is that the epistemic and methodological rules of the game are being constantly negotiated and renegotiated as we engage each other in discourse. And in Buchanan language, the constitutional framework of our conversation is being created and recreated as we go, and each of us as a citizen has a duty to participate in that reconstruction, in that ongoing constitutional conversation. So Buchanan proposes that each of us as a citizen has an ethical obligation to enter into that ongoing constitutional dialogue. Now, this is useful because, and the way he puts it, provides an answer to the obvious objection, because you say all this and it all sounds very nice, and one of the responses is, well, what if the workaday scholar has no time or taste for this rhetoric, pluralism business? Isn't it illiberal to expect and demand that people will enact these virtues? Wouldn't it be wiser and more humane to just sort of let the rhetoric pluralist people just become their own little specialized group, and then let the rest of us get on with what we're already doing? Buchanan recognizes that constitutional citizenship is a public good in the sense that individuals generally lack the incentive to participate in the maintenance and improvement of the constitutional structure. And so his response is that communities, and although he's never written directly on this issue that I'm speaking of, I'm speculating that this would be his take on it, that scientific communities can and should inculcate an ethical precept that would transcend the rational interest of the individual to motivate its members to act as citizens as well as specialists. So that the answer would be to try to preach, to persuade people that this is an important part of what it means to be an academic citizen. And Buchanan offers other reasons as to why this would be justified on liberal, classical liberal grounds. Number one, because it's based on the normative premise that individuals are the ultimate sovereigns in matters of social organization. That is, individual scholars. And so we shouldn't just have one of the things that Pete said in our original exchange was that the individual scholar doesn't need to be pluralist. The people who need to be pluralist are what he called the institutional caretakers, the sort of school of thought leaders, the journal editors, the people who sort of run the apparatus. And I disagree with that because I think, and I think Buchanan would too, because you want to protect the sovereignty of individual citizens by encouraging all of them to participate in the constitutional negotiation of the rules of the game, not just allowing the philosophical specialists or the school of thought leaders to arrogate that authority to themselves. Implications. I was struck, and I'm sorry I don't know the name of the person who said this morning, but at the end of the first session, there was a question about the wisdom of crowds versus...
Anna.
Yes, and sort of the idea that perhaps through deliberation we kind of dull the insights of the individual participants and to some extent sort of take away the gains of specialization or reduce them. And I think this was part of the impulse behind Pete's original position, was that we should just let specialists specialize, we should just let people doggedly pursue the truth as they see it, and let the marketplace of ideas sort it all out. And not have the individual, and basically seeing the sort of pluralism that I'm talking about as not much more than a tax on specialization. It's just one more burden, and just let the specialists be specialists. My take on this is that an ethic of scholarly pluralism will actually enhance specialization by extending and enriching the networks of exchange that exist within and among different schools. And this borrows from one of Buchanan's arguments that I like very much about the work ethic. Buchanan argues that the work ethic expands the network of trade, so that it isn't just, well, as he says, when the work ethic is widely instilled, it generates an extension in the size of the trading network and thus has positive economic spillovers through the further exploitation of gains from specialization. I think that's precisely the case that can be made for pluralist ethic, and I see that happening in three specific ways. Number one, helping to increase the intellectual alertness and discovery possibilities for the individual scholar by encouraging us to migrate into unfamiliar territory. Gordon Tullock, in his book, The Organization of Inquiry, has a remark about the special alertness of outsiders and the way that amateurs or non-specialists are often able to spot intellectual profit opportunities that are more or less invisible to trained specialists. And I think that's relevant here, because when you, and I know this from my own experience, when you wander into a community of scholars that you are an outsider in, all kinds of things are obvious to you that everyone else in the room takes for granted. And there is an advantage to that, and I think that has the potential to enrich discourse. And a related but different point, there's sort of a norm, and this is, I think, especially true among heterodox, non-mainstream economists, but perhaps it's true of mainstreamers in a way too, but there's sort of a norm of, or an ideal of what I call partisan monogamy. The idea that if you're a good scientist, you get married to your chosen perspective as a young adult, and you stick with it, you know, come what may, no matter what. And although we can perhaps think of examples of people who fit that description and admire their tenacity and you know, stick-to-itiveness, I'm struck by what people like Matt Ridley have been writing about all the intellectual advantages of promiscuity rather than monogamy. Ridley actually uses this. You may have seen in his recent book, he says that the unforeseen acceleration of innovation and living standards in the modern era is primarily a result of the fact that ideas are having sex with each other from all over the planet with ever-increasing promiscuity. Now, you know, in some realms promiscuity is not helpful, but in the realm of ideas, you know, I think one of the things about the 20th century, and particularly in economics, is we've gotten very involved in seeing our ideas as being connected to certain ideologies and certain politics, and seeing the stakes as being very high. And often, even images and rhetorics of war are used to think of, what's at stake in the battle between these ideas and these ideas. And so instead of thinking of ideas as sort of like food or music or something where, mixing and matching is fun and generative, it's seen as something inappropriate and questionable when one sort of wanders from or migrates from this perspective to that. And I'm wondering out loud here whether that might not be an unhealthy thing. I think a pluralist ethic would promote a more fluid, contingent image of intellectual association in which monogamy is always a valued option, but scholars are also free to come together in temporary aggregations to share, collaborate, and innovate. That's a Ridley quote. So one of the things about the pluralist ethic, it would lower the transactions cost of exchanges with scholars outside of one's own tribe. That was a very long number one. Number two, I think this ethic would increase the intellectual freedom of the individual scholar, in addition to alertness and discovery. By increasing our capacity for autonomous, fair-minded judgment of ideas, including our own. And all I'm thinking of here is, having just taught us a course on Adam Smith, is just the logic of Smith's moral theory, where we acquire the capacity for fair-minded judgment through repeated interactions with others, in what he calls the great school of self-command. Well, same thing happens in the intellectual world. The more we interact with different ideas, the more we are able to, the better we are able to judge. Don Lavoie liked to make this argument using Gadamer's work that the best form of objectivity is not detachment, but honest, open scholarship where you deal with ideas up close. And finally, I think a pluralist ethic would increase rivalry, competition, and learning among and within schools of thought. And part of this goes back to Polanyi. One of Polanyi's great innovations was this idea of overlapping conversations among different specialized groups. And this, one of the most concrete problems in scholarship today and always, I guess, is peer review, and how fit people are to provide meaningful peer review of one another's work. And I know enough journal editors to know how hard it is when they have pieces that where they want input from someone who isn't necessarily of that scholar's particular school of thought, but yet they don't want to allow the paper to be destroyed by someone who is hostile to that perspective of theirs. And so trying to find someone who can be both sympathetic and critical in the appropriate combination is not as easy as it sounds. And this is one of the things that the pluralist ethic would help us do a better job with. So to conclude, I'm arguing that if we want to make a liberal case for schools of thought, it is that they enhance intellectual freedom and learning, not just for their own members, but for the rest of us in the larger community of learning. I'm not at all the first person to make this argument. McQuaid and Buchos several years ago made an argument saying that schools offer increased interaction, feedback, and potential citations, thereby providing reputation-enhancing opportunities which would have otherwise been unavailable, and that sort of thing. Long ago, and this is reaching back 22 years, but Deirdre McCloskey, in her Rethinking Marxism article, which was a conversation with Ariel Plummer, made a very interesting remark that schools of thought are incubators for the kind of pluralist virtues that I'm speaking of. Deirdre's quote was this: "How do you think schools of thought form in economics? A group talks intensively to each other, respectfully, they allow each to influence the other. They stop sneering and start listening. I've seen it happen. Such a community comes to have few disagreements if the talking goes on long enough." And this is one of the things that I think the critics of schools of thought tend not to recognize. My argument is that in order to increase these beneficial effects, we should, number one, recognize that we as scholars are citizens as well as specialists. Number two, let go of the notion that schools have to be factions, that is, small groups with unitary goals, or what Hayek would have called taxis organizations. Schools can be polycentric, pluralistic organizations, just like the larger discipline that they are part of. In fact, most schools of thought, when you look at them up close, and you can name any one you like, are this way. They are sort of Catholic agglomerations, Catholic with a small c, of people who more or less agree on certain things, but who disagree on all kinds of other things. And if that is generally recognized, then schools themselves can be more vibrant, interesting, growing bodies of thought. And lastly, to let go of the notion that we as individual scholars have to be loyal members to one clan or nation or tribal group in order to make our best contribution to the whole. Thank you.
Let me pass the mic while I write it down.
Okay. I'll try and be brief. I have a fair amount to say. As you know, I've written quite a bit about pluralism, sort of calling for the death of various heterodox schools. And so I think, I just wanted to explain some of the differences that are there. I think one of the things that's incumbent upon a school, if it separates us, is to be able to find jobs for its students and sort of to continue to do that. And where that isn't happening, I think, sort of you have to start wondering, sort of, is this viable or not? So it has to be and maintain a viable situation for the students coming in. To have a variety of students coming in and then not be able to get jobs, and jobs that are there, is unfair to the students in some sense. I think that has to be taken. Again, a lot of my distinction between engineering and science has to do with thinking of this pluralism problem. And most of the schools of thought that we see have particular policy agendas, and much more so, there's unity of policy agendas in the schools of thought than there is in mainstream economics. And when that's the case, mainly it's engineering type issues that are there. The differences are in judgments and everything else. And so, within engineering, you'd expect many more schools of thought. So that's where, I suggested they should think of themselves as political economists, as opposed to economic science, because within economic science, there's a long heuristic and methodology pushing towards a single unity. I don't think there is a single unity within there. And so mainstream economics, when you tell them, you've got to be pluralist, that's saying, well, you're not pluralist. The way they view themselves is, there's behavioral economists, there's a variety of these other schools. There's
from M to M.
There's a variety of different approaches, and they have a lot of different policy views that come out, and when it's policy, it's there. And so most of the people that science takes place at a very, very high level of abstraction, the people who are there, and a lot of them are pretty good. If you're not preparing people who can carry on that debate, you shouldn't send people out to a debate where they're going to lose. Another issue is that these schools of thought tend to start publishing and talking among themselves. And that's the incubator. I said the incubator is a very important role, but incubators are incubators. It means you put them there for a while, and at some point, they have to go out and face the real world and move out of the incubator. And I haven't seen any developments within a lot of pluralistic schools that move them outside of the incubator. And if you're maintaining it there, you're not affecting the mainstream like one wanted to. That's where I started arguing for guerrilla pluralism. that, you know, sort of you send your students out prepared to fight guerrilla wars within the mainstream and stop separating like that. So I think, you know, sort of for those reasons, I think that has to be built in. Who isn't in favor of pluralism? Everyone is. It's all in terms of the definition that we're talking about, and it becomes rhetorical, you know, sort of discussions in the bad sense, as opposed to the bad sense. And I'm not supposed to use it in that. Okay. But I think those all have to be taken into account. So I don't think we disagree a lot about, you know, sort of the general nature of here it's desirable to be pluralistic. We disagree about a lot of the way it actually carries out and what happens. But my biggest concern is really for the students. And where I said Austrians, I think, can get jobs for their students. They seem to be doing pretty well. I suggested they should combine with a new school, and it would be better because then you wouldn't have a political, you know, sort of particular approach, and then you're seen as sort of that. But, you know, sort of outside of that, you know, sort of other schools where I saw the students having a harder time to get jobs, and the number of jobs were shrinking. So before there were here a set of schools you could get, then it became smaller and smaller. I worry about those students, and that was the main reason I've been concerned.
Rob, do you want to come back at all, or do you want me to take a few comments and then?
Let's just take a few comments. I'll keep track of it.
David and then Dan, I'm going to go to that.
Okay, so I want to follow up on some of the points that David Kohler has mentioned, but I wanted to actually mention sort of a concern I have that goes against it to begin with, which, and if this is not in the standard handbook of history of economics conference, I think it should be, that it goes at the first comment you mentioned by Milton Friedman, which is this real danger of talking about schools of the reification problem. And in terms of the plurality, it often sort of diminishes the heterogeneity within a given school. And this is one of the beefs a lot of Chicago people have, in fact, about Chicago, you know, this sort of standard Chicago School of Economics. But going in the other direction, one concept I think you should introduce, and this was I was first put on this by Phil Morawski in this recent book on the Montpellier Society, is the idea of the thought collective. I thought he was being snide when he referred to the neoliberal thought collective, but then I read about Ludwig Fleck, and I actually read Fleck and the idea of the thought collective. It actually means something different than I thought. I thought thought collective was a bunch of scholars working on a common problem, but Fleck's concept is that it's the common problem that draws in scholars. So the movement is away from the individual people or even schools to a common problem. And his point is the common problem often evolves in ways completely different than the original people working on it intended. He does the case of syphilis, but one case that I think useful to mention here, maybe we've been talking about, is the example of the Coase theorem, where it moves in a way different than Coase initially intended. And that's just sort of part of the process. And it leads to the issue of the evaluation of how you evaluate schools. Well, is there movement with the thought collective? And it's not the individual people, it's what the thought collective is going. Now, another completely different direction that's been very influential recently that you don't mention, I think you should, is the sociologist Andrew Abbott's work on the sociology of the professions. And it's a professional contestation model. I don't know if people are familiar with it. Some circles it's really big, but the idea is that professions, first of all, there's the idea that what is a profession changes, and we should keep that in mind with economics. But it changes because you have these different groups competing with each other and contesting for control over the territory. And in some ways it's a neoliberal thing because the different groups disagree with each other, but it is the sort of virtue of competition and contestation. There is the issue of does the, in some sense, socially best group win out or not, but I think it's a useful perspective that you could bring in. One particular character you may want to bring in with Polanyi that I think is on the other side of this is C.P. Snow and the two cultures issue. They didn't get along with each other, but it's a different model of pluralism or anti-pluralism that you should mention. And then just one final kind of thing, I just sort of occurs to me thinking about where economics stand these days and how it's evolving is where economics is being located and the choices that involves. It could be in arts and sciences, it could be in business schools, increasingly, like my own schools, in public policy. And I think that has different consequences for how economics evolves or how it's going to survive. So that influences pluralism. So.
Pass it to Dan.
And Rob, I want to maybe throw out the idea of an alternative to Ridley's metaphor of monogamy and promiscuity. Yeah. And that would be homogamy and heterogamy, or inbreeding and whatever the antonym would be, outbreeding. That is the inbreeding that's a problem. When I think of promiscuity, it's just kind of walking down the hallway and dipping into any conversation that somebody is having. And that's not a very reasonable way to organize our lives, to really be, we don't want to be intellectually promiscuous, but we want to be broad. searching in other areas than those that we're comfortable with.
That one is three questions. One is, the big one is, I wonder what you do about the fact that also people who fund research, particularly think tanks and institutes, are not academic pluralists and are not likely to become so, have other motivations in funding such research. And that, you know, if you're serious about this, it seems like you have to take that on. And the second, I mean, I'm basically a political theorist. I'm one of your outsider amateur, so take that for its worth. But yeah, it strikes me that the way that the person you cited, we talked about partisanship as a problem, and I think there's a general reluctance to, if someone says my research is motivated by political aims, interpret most people as a bad thing. But I'm not sure that's a bad thing, in the sense that I think maybe it'd be useful to figure out how much the disagreement between different schools has to do with methods and findings and so forth, and how much is about actually legitimate moral disagreement about normative ends and the kind of society that one aspires to build. And it seems to be natural and desirable. There is normative disagreement, and this in turn has profound implications on what kinds of questions that you pursue and how to do so. And I think that's another route to pluralism that avoids setting up an unattainable and usually false claim that research is not politically motivated in some, you know, some sense. Obviously, I'm not advocating, generating findings for some very specific health and politician, but in a more general normative sense. And then the third thing is, I love you take up your question about education you set aside, especially at the liberal arts level. What would it entail to create your ideal citizen?
Thank you.
I'd like to add some more to what Dave Collender said about schooling and our obligations to our students. I went to a graduate school that was very pluralistic, and University of Tennessee. And when I was there in the 80s, we had institutional economists, and we also had Paul Davidson was there, was a post-Keynesian economist. And as a student, I asked, I remember Phil Morawski came, and I was taking my first semester of econometrics, and I asked the econometrics professor to go, and I would like to hear his observations. And he refused to even go. So not only is there the obligation of getting the students jobs, but I think it's really important to model this kind of behavior. I think that needs to be part of the professional ethic, that we really will go and listen and model what this would all mean. So I think that's an important aspect of it.
Rob, whenever you want to come in, you're welcome to. I'm just, there's
no, it's good. We're going to keep going. This is good.
You can give another paper.
Yeah. I would like to follow up on the issue of ethics, and I wholeheartedly agree that to some degree, economists need to have a plurality of ethic. We tend to just by de facto be cost-benefit kind of consequentialists, utilitarians, if you will, and that doesn't help us very much know the boundaries of our discipline and when markets will work and when they won't work. And so I agree, we can't say let the editor be the pluralist. We have to all know ourselves at least enough about other ethical approaches that we know the limits of our own discipline, so that when Larry Summers writes his infamous memo on sending pollution to Africa because they have lower costs there, you know, he did it in jest, let's assume, and that he knows better, but the readers of the memo probably don't know better. We tend to be, naturally take up the cost-benefit ethic, without considering the rights of minorities. We take it for granted, like the air we breathe, that there are human rights. And we also take it for granted that people have goodwill. And so I think having plurality of ethical approaches, consequentialists, maybe a little throw in some Kantian, throw in a heavy dose of virtue ethics, and now you have something you can talk about and help yourself in doing public policy analysis a whole lot better.
Yes, you have, I think you raised very interesting issues. And my question is, in your title, you have social science in general, but your presentation and the whole discussion is pretty much about economics. And my question is about the relationships between economics and the other social sciences, sociology, demography, whatever, because I somehow have the feeling that some of the issues that you raised about schools of thought could be quite similar to what happens in the relationships between disciplines. And so how would you, would that fit into your analysis? Would you see the relationships between disciplines and somehow bringing the schools of thought to a higher level? Or how would you see situations in which the rank commonalities may be of object, but like economics and sociology just don't speak to each other or don't listen to each other? So how would that fit into your approach?
A funny story about your experience with Moravsky. My cousin, my mother's first cousin, was a very, very famous statistician, a protege of Einstein's. He came to Berkeley and was asked to give a seminar for the students, and refused to give the seminar, refused to begin it until every single professor, even his friends, left the room. And the students were really grateful. His first question was, do you want to be like those guys? Second, I think part of the problem is this word science. We're not a science. When I look at the different schools of thought, each school of thought, each great thinker has his or her own vision of the kind of society that they want to live in. They don't acknowledge that. They say we're talking about science. Smith has this sort of independent, self-sufficient, professional, small business owner. Keynes has his very wealthy bankers who have social conscience. Schumpeter has his entrepreneur. Unless you get down and you talk about what kind of society you want, that is not talking in terms of science, you're never going to get anywhere. Because with such a dialogue about the kind of society you want, you'll find commonality. I mean, Sanders made a couple jokes about me agreeing with Jim and things like that, because we have certain commonalities. If we want to talk about science, and I mentioned the labor theory of value, conversation finished.
Yeah, I would like to add to this, because when you talk about schools, you seem to be talking about schools of thought, but schools are also schools of practice, schools of language, schools of different subjects, schools of perceiving things. And here I want to come back to Ludwig Fleck, because when he talks about thought collectives, he talks about thought styles, and he speaks about how people learn to perceive things, and what they see is dependent on which thought collective they are part of. So I was just thinking that your idea of a pluralistic discourse won't be realized so easily if you take all these things into account that Ludwig Fleck talked about in 35, and there's a bulk of literature in science studies about this.
I'm coming into this a little bit ignorantly of some things, so take it with a grain of salt. Some of this almost sounds like a board meeting of OPEC to me. That there's sort of a cartelization of the discipline of economics, and we're trying to decide how we're going to sell it. And we're talking about whether or not our students are going to be able to get jobs, me being one of the most junior people in the room, and at least with the most trepidous prospects of getting a job. maybe all of our students don't need jobs. Perhaps there's an oversupply of economists. There's not necessarily a good market for economics in terms of competition in some ways. So just your thoughts on those ideas.
I've heard so much now that I'd like to say something about all of you too, but that's not gonna happen. First of all, I liked your talk a lot. Let me quickly come back to the expertise thing. I think you're right about stressing the merits of deliberation. I think with the expertise discussion, I was trying to point out that when we are talking about expertise, we're not talking about intellectual discussion that's fruitful, but about getting answers, and that's, I think, a pretty valuable distinction. And I think before having expertise by aggregating the opinions of experts, we should have experts, and I think that's where the intellectual discussion and deliberation comes in. So that's why I think your talk was valuable. You made me think of Robert Brandom, who talks about Hegel's way of trying to decide whether Hegel's way of balancing between negative freedom and positive freedom. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I'm just gonna try to quickly summarize it. Hegel said it was okay to take a little bit of negative freedom away if it gave a huge amount of positive freedom in return. And I think when we're talking about deliberation, it does take some information, or it may, we may lose something on the way, but we get so much in return from exchanging ideas that it makes it worthwhile, I think. Then what Verena said about practice, I'm into practice theory as well. I don't see why we could not realize pluralism that easily when we take practice in account. I think, I just don't agree. Maybe we should talk about that later. What I was wondering about you, Rob, what is the main incentive or the main reason or the main motive for people to go with your ethics? What is the ground of the ethical bindingness of that responsibility? It's a question I ask coming from Joe Rouse's work. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He talks about practice as a normative concept, and he tries to find out what it is about science, even though we might not all agree that economics is a science, what it is about science or thinking that has some binding, that has bindingness about us. And I was wondering if you could say what makes you think that people will go along with those responsibilities you want to give to them. I think you're right in that, but I'd like to know why you think that they will do that.
Well, while Sandy's getting around to it, let me just address some of these, and I'll start with yours. I want to think about that. I don't know. I don't have an off-the-cuff response to that. But I gather you're asking not just like what's their incentive. You're asking what ethical reason would be, or sort of what would be the ethical traction of the idea with people.
It may be an incentive. It may be a reason. It may be an ethical principle. Though I think those are all different categories of why people will do something.
Okay.
Yeah.
I appreciate your comments. I don't, and I think a lot about negative and positive freedom, but not all the way back to Hegel, so that's a helpful reference too. Could I just ask you to briefly repeat what you said about, I'm going to have to look into Fleck, but why did you think that thinking of schools more broadly would limit the relevance of pluralism?
Not the relevance of pluralism, it's just not so easy to realize. Because a school is not only a school of thought, they have different languages, different subjects, they even have different ways of perceiving things. Like, and this is what Fleck focuses on.
Yeah, these are the thought styles term you use.
Exactly, it's the thought style that comes from a certain thought collective, and it's binding. And so he has, I think, a
So it's
strong
hard
idea.
for two thought collectives to even comprehend each other that way.
Exactly, they may see, but it's very, very difficult.
Okay.
So this is what I was saying. I think it's just too easy to say that people just have to talk to each other.
Okay.
So it's much more complex.
I'm married to a cultural anthropologist, so I'm sure she can help us.
Do we have more comments?
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
Michael.
Great. So I like this because you're trying to figure out what recommends the different schools and what works against it. So the way that I'm thinking about getting into this is to look at Adam Smith. Book one, Adam Smith is division of labor. So you have things that recommend division of labor, dexterity, saving time, or innovation, or what we call now learning by doing. And so those are really strong. You've got the whole book one that recommends those types of things. But then you've got book five, where you get these limits, right? So the fear is that if everyone just goes out of the house as soon as they're able and starts working at a machine, then they become reduced to the lowest and meanest state in which they're possible. Adam Smith addresses this with education for the young, so he calls it education for the young. So we have to provide education, which I think is your ethical standard, inculcating some sort of idea of ethics. Some people talk about mentorship or sending their students out in a bunch of different ways like this. But then immediately following up education of the young is lifelong education, where he starts talking about competitive religions. He ends up putting the focal point, or the asymptotic, for religion is the pure and rational philosophy, and the pure and rational religion that philosophers have been looking for throughout the ages. Now, I wonder about this religious imagery because, of course, religions have pastors. And the thing that we're trying to compete at is to have followers to our own disciplines. So it gets back to this idea of a competitive element. So why not have a journal editor, I guess, trying to get the largest group of people submitting to a journal, has some sort of competitive process, because we know that the journal editor is really bad, just like a bad pastor, then the pews will be empty. So that's kind of how I'm thinking of it. So who are the consumers in your model, right? Like who are the people actually consuming the product that we create? And I think that might be missing somehow. And just on a final note, to connect Dan and your conversation, one of the things that Becky has probably said as an amendment to your conversation is, be promiscuous when you're young, and then marry.
You want to come back on
Well, let me just come back on a couple of things. Because I think your reference to Smith and the education thing is very relevant, because if you reread that passage in Smith where he talks about the over-specialized worker becoming as ignorant as a human being can possibly become, what he says over and over again is such a person loses the ability to judge. And I think, the analogy is crude, but when you teach a person only one way of thinking, and when you further add to that, the sort of sense that, what they are learning is the only reasonable way to think about economic problems, and others are, to be seen as dubious. It does impair their ability to judge their own ideas and others. And so I do think, Smith talks about education, and I do think that ultimately this leads to a discussion about how we educate economists. And Jeff Hodgson wrote a piece back in 2002, and it was actually a comment, but it was one of the only times I've seen someone, and as I say this, I'm sure, Dave, I'm going to forget about things you've written, but his suggestion was that every PhD program should have a required philosophy component, just to give people, and history too, but just sort of the liberal education stuff that would give you the ability to begin sorting out for yourself what some of these meta-economic issues are about, and sort of how to think for yourself as a professional in this field. And that without that, you're really leaving students without, lacking in those same abilities that Smith was describing. And this was the gist of a lot of that post-autistic stuff too. It was just, give us the tools to think for ourselves. And so I do think that's where a lot of this goes, and it's something that I intend to keep working on myself.
This is another comment combining Adam Smith, Pete Becky, and then a little bit of Dave Polander. So what Michael was just talking about reminded me of Smith's discussion of, England versus Scotland and the university systems and how they worked. And it seems like what's missing in the whole discussion is what you pointed out, which is the market test, right? How do students get placed? And this is not only true for PhD students, but it's true for undergraduates as well. How relevant is it to our decision-making and how we structure our curriculum? And so I think students provide two types of tests. One, a content check, because they are always, there to tell you that doesn't make any sense. And this doesn't sound plausible if you think about the real world. And then also an output check. Are we creating the types of students that will find jobs? And so it seems like the reason why science can go off track is because this institutional check, the institutions do the heavy lifting, this is where Pete Becky comes from, the institutional check is missing, or the output part of the market test is minimized in the institutional structure, and therefore we go off track. I don't know if that makes any sense, but we're not thinking about, we're not, the institutional structure of education is such that we don't care so much about the output, therefore we get bad science.
We're going to come back to this.
Well, you got your hand up here.
I put my hand up.
I didn't see it. You gotta wait.
Pluralism along with everyone else.
That was in the last session here. I saw it. It expired.
During this moment of chaos.
This is order. Yeah.
Well, I do know that part of, and this goes back to Dave's original thing about getting students jobs, part of the professionalization routine at GMU now is the whole thing about liberal education, because they see, and I think they're right, that a major niche for their students are liberal arts colleges where the skills of being able to teach in a way, like you said, to pass the content and market tests there. But, and also as a way, in terms of how you relate to colleagues who come from different places and who have different ideas. And so they had a little workshop, I think it was Steve Horowitz and Emily Shanley Wright talking to the graduate students recently about this. And it's the kind of thing that I think other non-mainstream programs could make a bigger deal about, because one of the comparative advantages that heterodox students have, generally speaking, is being conversant across a larger swath of economics than their mainstream counterparts. I mean, one of my dearest friends in my department came in, mainstream labor economist who had never heard of Keynes. And I just had no earthly idea what Keynes. They're not learning a whole lot about what happened, before whatever articles were relevant to their dissertation, which were published 10 years ago.
Pluralism is definitely an interesting concept, and I'm thinking about that in the scope of Ukraine. Since it was the part of the Soviet Union, we had one-party system, and then it collapsed and we switched to multi-party system. And in Ukraine right now, officially registered, there are over 100 parties. And I would say exactly. So people feel, when people go to the booths to cast their ballot, they are so confused, they're thinking, this party just, what do I vote? So they heard some notion of maybe what they feel about one of that aspect of the activity of one party or another. So I'm thinking about the danger of polarization. So here we have very narrow approach, for example, in political arena, one-party system, and then we have pluralism and all of these conflicting and opposing viewpoints. So I'm wondering where the boundary between pluralism and narrow-mindedness lies, so that we avoid the danger of polarization of approaches.
Deirdre is next.
You moved her up, Sandra.
I did. You're on the second round, so you're not at the bottom.
A small terminological suggestion that we strike the word mainstream from our vocabulary. That's to if we who don't regard ourselves as orthodox, which is an alternative name for mainstream, and that would be fine. Keep calling the orthodox people the mainstream. We're never going to get students that I don't want to be in some backwater. I want to be in the mainstream. So call them Samuelsonians, which is what they are, and have done with it. But my main point, although I have lots of thoughts about this, it's very interesting. It seems to me that true liberalism, the sort that you're advocating, requires an ethic of egalitarian dignity. That is, you have to really believe that you can learn something from a janitor. If you don't believe that, you're not a real liberal in that sense. And this is against the older model, which is hierarchical dignity, where I'm to curtsy to the Lord, and where the Lord is to bow to the king, and where it's all arranged in what was called the great chain of being. But the trouble is, and I see this in economics very much, is that we have built into this, I think it must be biological, a worshipful attitude towards charisma, towards the barons. I mean, in a vulgar, non-academic example is the obsession with fame in modern culture. Paris Hilton is famous for being famous. But we do the same thing inside economics, and it's undignified, it's undemocratic, and furthermore, it's stupid to think, oh boy, this guy at MIT, boy, he's really good. He does experiments on mosquito nets, and he puts holes in them to see if it works. I mean, we've got to stop the hero worship stuff. I mean, even my heroes, I got to stop worshiping Milton Friedman and Hayek and Polanyi.
Don't go too far.
Not Carl Polanyi, his brother.
I want to thank Rob. Any talk that has everybody in the room is a good talk.
Well, or a terrible talk, one of the two.
Thank you for helping me get over my fame work. I've been to get over that for a long time.
So, Rob, some thoughts. Back in the dark ages, I thought a lot about the marketplace of ideas, metaphor, because that's what happens when people trained as economists try to think about these things. One thing that is clear, I think, is that what we have is in modern economics is intellectual specialization without trade, which is worse than intellectual autarky.
You said it's a few bricks short of a load.
And the problem goes all the way back to Smith's pin factory example, because pin factory workers don't trade with one another. It's not the firm that sets the limits to specialization, it's the market. That's a different thing. The second thing about the marketplace of ideas metaphor is that people usually run together two things that need to be kept distinct. I think this is important for your purposes. One is an epistemic claim about that the truth will out, right? The small t truth will out. That's very different from what economists usually mean with a marketplace of ideas metaphor, and that is consumer sovereignty. And consumers will get what they want. And consumers don't always want the truth in science. The truth can threaten your funding. The truth can be damn inconvenient, actually. And the truth may, in fact, be inaccessible in many of the disciplines that your paper concerns. And so a lot depends then on who's the market, or classically would say, who's the audience. And so is the market other suppliers of modern economics? People who read the journals? Is it literate citizens who we write for as public intellectuals? The opinion makers, the chattering classes, or is it the state? This is where expertise enters again. I think that professional disagreement is bad for business if you're in the business of retailing expertise, which modern economics is very much in the business of. And I think that Michael's rogues gallery of law, Cantillon, Petty, and Mandeville provide kind of a nice, rich illustration of how inquirers, even if they're as high-minded as your Republican citizens might be, have multiple sorts of interests, some of which are epistemic and others of which are murderous and promiscuous. I'll stop there. David.
David, you're going to be the last one.
I think this is wonderful. A couple of years ago, we did some work on Richard Waitley, who is sort of remembered in some circles as one of the heavy hitters in the broad church movement. Archbishop of Dublin. And what we wrote up, maybe we didn't push it hard enough, maybe we didn't stress it, is something that I think your paper is up against, and that is the role of factions in truth-seeking and ethics. And Whaley starts off with the assumption, which is defensible, that people have presuppositions, and that presuppositions give them the way of truth. This is all his work on fallacies and why we fall into fallacies. He then makes the theological claim that Christianity is a religion of truth, and then makes the further claim that the best way to check the proof, to protect ourselves from fallacy, is to have someone with opposing presuppositions to check the proof. And there's a Harry Johnson joke that goes right there that you will remember. Right? And that from this, he then concludes that we are under strict obligation as Christians to protect the other point of view, to keep them around so that they can help us find the truth, because truth-seeking is not incentive compatible. We have a discussion with people with opposing presuppositions who are just very, very delighted to find mistakes in our work. This is the best way of checking the proof. And it's in the relation between Waitley and Mill, because it's going to sound like
it sounds like Mill.
Yeah, but it's not, because it's got this. It's from a strict Christian obligation point of view. There is no doubt that Waitley believes in the truth, but the problem is it's not to our interest to find the truth. And so that it comes to very similar policy implications to do it with Mill, but it's very different foundations. And I think that may be a closer fit to the kind of stuff you're doing. How does ethics relate to self-interest, to truth-seeking, and all that stuff? And I think there's and I just close it on one of your heroes. And I remember in George's History of Thought class many years ago, he defended history of economics because he said that if we only know one model, we confuse it with the truth.
I'm shocked.
did though say we shouldn't have a history of economics at the university.
Well, I was when he decided he didn't want to confuse things with the truth.
Yeah. He was older than.
You didn't want to rewire then.
Rob, do you want to say anything in response to everybody's?
You get one sentence to answer.
Minus 12 minutes, right? Minus 12 minutes he does.
We're going yeah, we're going to finish up soon.
Okay. I appreciate all of the egalitarian dignity indeed. So I look forward to discussing other things with everyone this week. That's fine. Thank you.
Thanks very much.